Before empires ruled with laws, armies, and borders, something far more powerful quietly shaped the ancient world. Not kings, not decrees, not conquest, prices. Long before Rome marched its legions across the Mediterranean, merchants had already accomplished what empires would spend centuries trying to control. They turned chaos into coordination, violence into value, and a fractured multilingual world into a single marketplace. And the people behind it weren't emperors, they were traders. Welcome to the financial historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand how radical this really was, you have to forget modern maps and modern assumptions. Picture the Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. This was not a unified world. By modern standards, it was chaos. City-states rose and collapsed constantly. Kingdoms fought over coastlines. Pirates dominated open waters. There was no shared legal system, no common currency, and no authority capable of enforcing contracts across borders. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from home, and almost no one trusted outsiders. On paper, large-scale trade should have been impossible, and yet it wasn't. By the early first millennium BCE, goods were moving across thousands of kilometers with surprising consistency. Tin from Iberia, copper from Cyprus, cedar wood from the Levant, luxury dyes, textiles, glass, and metalwork flowing through ports that had nothing in common politically, but everything in common economically. The architects of this system were the Phoenicians. They didn't build an empire. They didn't command massive armies. They didn't impose laws through conquest. In fact, they never unified anything by force. What they did instead was far more subtle and far more durable. They built a network. Phoenician society consisted of small coastal city-states like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. These cities were vulnerable. They lacked large hinterlands and couldn't survive prolonged wars. Their security didn't come from walls or legions. It came from ships, relationships, and reputation. If trade failed, they failed. That constraint shaped everything. Because when you don't have power, you have to build trust. And when you build trust at scale, value begins to standardize, whether you intend to or not. The first thing Phoenician traders standardized wasn't prices. It was behavior. In a world without international courts or enforceable contracts, trade depended entirely on repeat interactions. A merchant who cheated might profit once and then disappear forever from the network. Ports talked to each other. Traders shared information. Reputation traveled faster than ships. Trust became a form of collateral. This is the part modern audiences often underestimate. Trust wasn't moral, it was economic. If you were reliable, you were included. If you weren't, you were excluded. And exclusion meant commercial death. When you don't have courts, trust becomes very expensive to lose. Once that trust network existed, prices began to align naturally. Not because anyone set them, but because competition enforced them. Phoenician traders dealt in commodities with widely understood uses and relatively stable demand. Copper and tin used to make bronze. Silver measured by weight, not stamped authority. Timber for shipbuilding and construction. These were functional goods, not symbolic ones. Here's where the system quietly locked into place. If tin was cheaper in Iberia and more expensive in the eastern Mediterranean, traders moved it east. If copper was abundant in Cyprus and scarce elsewhere, ships adjusted their routes. Every profitable price difference attracted competition, and competition erased the difference. This process, buying where something is cheap and selling where it's expensive, isn't modern finance. It's arbitrage. and arbitrage is older than empires. The more Phoenician traders moved goods, the more price gaps collapsed. A merchant in Carthage couldn't wildly overcharge for copper if competitors knew what copper cost elsewhere. A port couldn't isolate itself economically if ships could simply bypass it. Markets disciplined prices faster than kings ever could. There was no master plan, no council deciding what tin should cost. Standardization emerged as a byproduct of efficiency. The traders who adapted survived. The ones who didn't vanished. But the Phoenicians' real advantage wasn't ships or metals. It was information. They knew where harvests failed. They knew which mines were flooding. They knew when wars disrupted supply routes. In an era where news traveled at the speed of wind and ore, information was power. They didn't just react to prices. They anticipated them. By doing so, they smoothed volatility across regions. Shortages in one area were offset by supply from another. Surpluses were absorbed before they collapsed local value. Over time, local producers adjusted their expectations. Farmers, miners, and craftsmen began pricing goods, not just based on local conditions, but on what the wider Mediterranean market would bear. Ports became synchronized. Inland economies lagged behind. With that synchronization came something unprecedented, a de facto economic system that ignored political borders entirely. The Phoenicians never conquered the Mediterranean, but they made it legible, predictable, and tradable. Economic integration didn't follow empire. Empire followed economic integration. That's the part history textbooks often get wrong. And this is where the story turns, because once prices stabilize, once markets scale, and once value becomes predictable across regions, power takes notice. Trade stopped being local. Value stopped being negotiated in isolation. Markets began operating at a scale no single ruler could fully control. This was the peak of the Phoenician system, and the moment it became vulnerable. Standardized prices made trade faster. Faster trade made it more profitable. And profitable systems attract attention, not from merchants, but from states, because once value becomes predictable, it becomes taxable. Greek city-states were among the first to formalize what Phoenician traders had built informally for centuries. They introduced stamped coinage, not to invent value, but to certify it. A coin wasn't new. It was silver by weight, with a political guarantee attached. Rome would later perfect this move. The Roman Empire didn't create Mediterranean trade, it inherited it. Ports were already connected. Prices were already aligned. Supply routes were already mapped. What Rome added was force. Legions to secure trade lanes. Laws to formalize contracts. Taxes to extract value from a system merchants had built without imperial permission. This is the great irony of Phoenician success. They didn't lose because their system failed. They lost because it worked too well. Informal trust networks were replaced by formal institutions. Reputation gave way to regulation. Weighed metal gave way to stamped authority. Negotiation gave way to taxation. Markets unified the Mediterranean before empires ever could. But empires decided who benefited most from that unification, and this pattern didn't end in antiquity. Fast forward to the modern world, and the architecture feels familiar, just scaled beyond recognition. There is no global government, no single authority ruling international trade, and yet prices for oil, wheat, copper, and shipping converge across continents. A drought in one region ripples through markets worldwide. A disruption in a single shipping lane raises costs thousands of miles away. Just like the ancient Mediterranean, value today is coordinated by networks, not borders. The US dollar functions much like Phoenician silver once did. Not because it's imposed everywhere by law, but because markets accept it. Trust, liquidity, and information give it power long before politics does. But here's where the parallel turns uncomfortable. Prices are globally synchronized. Wages are not. Goods adjust instantly to global conditions. Labor adjusts slowly, locally, and often painfully. Inflation spreads faster than income. Asset prices respond before paychecks do. The system still rewards those closest to information and liquidity, and punishes those who experience change last. Nothing fundamental has changed, only the scale. Power didn't disappear. It repositioned itself. States learned to tax flows instead of territories. Corporations learned to arbitrage regulation instead of geography. Individuals were left navigating a system that feels abstract, distant, and increasingly out of their control. Here's the lesson the Phoenicians unintentionally left behind. Power does not create markets. Markets create power. Those who standardize value don't need to rule openly. They influence outcomes quietly. And once systems become large enough, no single actor truly controls them. They can only steer them, extract from them, or shield themselves from their consequences. Empires rise believing they command markets. Markets endure by ignoring empires. That's why economic history isn't just about the past. It's about pattern recognition. Because the same forces that shaped ancient trade still govern modern finance. Just faster, larger, and harder to see. If you understand how prices converge, if you understand who benefits when they move, and if you recognize that coordination always precedes control, you stop mistaking stability for safety. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look,